Like to call the meeting to order on St. Patrick's Day, Board of Supervisors. We're going to be going into closed session, but before I do, I'd like to have clerk to the board read the items for closed session.
Item 1, pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D1, conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation, Calaveras residents against commercial marijuana, the County of Calaveras Board of Supervisors of Calaveras County, et al., Calaveras County Superior Court case number 19CV44446.
Since there's no members of the audience here, why don't you just go ahead with item 2 and 3?
Okay.
Thank you.
Pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D1, conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation, Andrew Greer and Golden State Herb Incorporated et al., the County of Calaveras, Calaveras County Superior Court case number 18CV43460. Item 3, pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D1, conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation, California Occupational Safety and Health Appeals Board, Calaveras County Public Works, case number 1386290.
Okay, we will recess into closed session. I'd like to reconvene the Board of Supervisors. You can see if the camera pans the room, it's a little different than it normally is. If you can, could you please stand and we'll do the pledge? Thank you. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. As you can see, we're trying to do the appropriate things to keep our staff and the public healthy, and it's a new day for a while, and I'm not sure where the board, how the board meetings will be managed going forward, but today we're trying to keep it as close to normal as possible. Okay, are there any staff announcements? Oh, yeah, closed session. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Could you please read the outcome of closed session? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Item 1, pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D1, conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation, Calaveras residents against commercial marijuana, the County of Calaveras, Board of Supervisors of Calaveras County et al., Calaveras County Superior Court case number 19CV44446. There was no reportable action taken. Item 2, pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D1, conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation, Andrew Greer and Golden State Herb Incorporated et al., the County of Calaveras, Calaveras County Superior Court case number 18CV43460. There was no reportable action taken. Item 3, pursuant to Government Code Section 54956.9D1, conference with legal counsel regarding existing litigation, California Occupational Safety and Health Appeals Board, Calaveras County Public Works, case number 1386290. There was no reportable action taken.
Thank you. Are there any staff announcements? Yes.
Good morning,
Mr. Alton.
Madam Chair and Board of Supervisors. I wanted to report that, as you have seen in internal communications to our employees, I am working with our department heads to develop protocols for our county operations, similar to what we've seen with other public entities, to do our best to not only maintain essential services, but while also protecting both the public and our staff from potential exposure By the end of today, I'll have clear direction on what we'll be doing with county operations and how mandated services will be fulfilled. I'll report those not only to the board, but to staff and to the public as well. We'll use social media and the news outlets. We haven't finalized that yet, but when I have it finalized, I will push that out so our public is aware of how they can access our services and what limitations there will be.
Thank you. Anyone else? No. Okay. Are there any public comments? Mr. Segala, is there any public comment you'd like to make today?
No, I think
Oh.
wisdom would be silence.
Thank you, Mr. Segala. I'd like to move to the regular agenda. There is no consent agenda today. Madam Clerk.
Item 4 is from Public Health Services to adopt a resolution ratifying the declaration of a local health emergency by the county health officer related to the novel coronavirus COVID-19.
Okay. Dr. Kaleda, please. This is an item that comes under his jurisdiction, and I've asked him to come, if he would just give us a 2-minute update and let the public know that you are here and you're still involved
Yes,
with the decision-making regarding this in Calaveras County.
yes, thank you, Madam Chairman and Board of Supervisors. I want to frame the discussion of the declaration of the local health emergency by just giving you and the community an update on the novel coronavirus situation in our community. In California, there's 335 positive cases that have been confirmed of COVID-19. There's been 6 deaths. 11,700 people in California are under self-monitoring across 49 local health jurisdictions. So almost every county in California has been impacted by this. That's after returning to the U.S. from travel. There's 19 public health labs in California that are now testing for COVID-19, including our public health laboratory in San Joaquin County, which is our public health laboratory that we contract with, because Calaveras County doesn't maintain our own public health laboratory. But now our public health laboratory is able to do the coronavirus testing, which will result in quicker turnaround to our residents who need to be tested. Now, there's been 2 positive cases in Calaveras County residents, a parent and child in the Copperopolis area. The parent is a first responder who works outside of the community and contracted the illness in the course of his work, moving patients as a first responder. And his child attends the Copperopolis Elementary School in Copperopolis, which has created a lot of public health investigation that's needed to go around exposures to that case. So we have numerous outstanding tests among contacts to the active case, including other children in the school and staff at the school as well, who've developed symptoms. So anybody who's exposed to a case of coronavirus, the process is that a case investigation by public health takes place. All of those cases are interviewed, evaluated, and if they did have contact to the active case during the time that the person was contagious, then they need to be quarantined, they need to self-isolate themselves, and they need to be tested immediately at the onset of symptoms if they develop fever or respiratory symptoms. And that's happened to several individuals in our community. So far, all the tests have come back negative that we've received the results of. We haven't had any additional positive cases, even people who've had exposure to the 2 active cases that we know about in our community. So far we're not seeing community transmission to others associated with those 2 cases that we have confirmed so far. We have recommended to the school superintendents closure of all of the schools in Calaveras County at this time. And the schools are complying with that at least until April 6th. Some of the school districts are going to extend that to the following week to correspond to their normal spring break time that they would be off anyway. But the ultimate decision of when to reopen the schools will be based on whether or not we have disease occurrence at the time that school closures are set to expire. We've recommended, of course, suspension and postponement of group activities and gatherings in the community, and you've done an excellent job here, the way you've rearranged the proceedings of the Board of Supervisors meeting, both the way that you've aligned yourselves and as well as the community that's been encouraged to pursue social distancing. The Governor of California has recommended, of course, that bars, nightclubs, other establishments be closed, and that restaurants engage in social distancing among their patrons who are going to consume food and beverages on the property, and encourage takeout and home delivery of food as much as possible. So the declaration of a local health emergency happens during events like this, typically. The Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, has declared a state of emergency, and we have issued a local health emergency in Calaveras County that requires your ratification within 7 days. A local health emergency is a primary tool for local jurisdictions to allow for the mobilization of county resources, accelerate emergency planning, boost staffing, coordinate with other county, state, and local partners, and allow for reimbursement for the acquisition of critical medical supplies and staff to respond to the outbreak. So before you is the declaration of local health emergency, and my recommendation is that that be approved by you and allow us to continue those emergency measures to meet this crisis head-on in our community.
Any questions or comments from the board? Oh, I didn't see your red light.
No, business
Go
first.
ahead.
No questions. Thank you for the update, Dr. Kaleda. With that, when we have the opportunity, I'll move it.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you guys for all the good work you guys have got going on. So keep at it. Anything we can do. I'm ready to
Yes,
second.
thank you very much. Mr. Segala, do you have any questions?
Al Gallant Taxpayer Association, and Marita coughed 3 times.
I did.
One of the, we're seeing all levels of government really activated to try to fight this, this problem. And one of the things we got to keep in mind is that this is, this country is not a dictatorship or a social society. We actually are a free society, which means we have a constitution that protects individual rights. Those rights are life, liberty, and property. So each public official, from the president on down, is really charged with protecting those 3 rights. In times of an emergency, sometimes this can be overlooked. But any changes that we do, or this board approves, should should take in consideration that they must be temporary in nature and address the problem. They should not be changes that seek to reshape our form of government, and particularly not to grow government. And so that's my thoughts, is that we be aware that people, whether they're sick or not, do have individual rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Segala. Yes.
I have a question. Dr. Kaleda, is there any other precautions or anything that you're thinking of possibly doing that you haven't done so far?
In some communities, you'll see more aggressive orders on the part of the local health officer to quarantine people at home, to self-isolate, to pretty much suspend, all activities and, really stay inside, especially for people who are elderly. Those are people who are at higher risk for complications if they were to develop the novel coronavirus infection. Right now, we've had excellent response from the community based on our recommendations, which have been pretty much mirroring what the state and federal guidance is about suspension of mass gatherings, community meetings, clubs, social gatherings. All of those events have been very well following our recommendations. So I don't see the issuance of stricter orders of, the community to shut down activities that are taking place on their own at this point.
Yeah, yesterday, the governor suspended all construction jobs in the Bay Area as a precaution too. So actually I had some jobs going, we were shut down. So that's something that he's done, and it was complied by most construction sites. I don't know if that's something that could be looked at here. I don't know what's going on here, but if, that's why I'm saying other things that you could be looking at that going forward, you may be.
At this point, Supervisor Tofinelli, I don't have plans to recommend that to the community because, like I said, the recommendations that we've issued so far have been very well followed by the community and by all the organizations in our community. I think I'll have to leave that open-ended, though, to see where this outbreak goes, to see what the disease occurrence looks like in our community, and to make sure that people don't start to get fatigued with the compliance of the recommendations that we've issued so far, which are essentially voluntary for the most part.
Thank you.
I have a, good morning, Kristen Stranger, Health and Human Services. I did want to add a little bit to that. I think another reason too why you're seeing individual county responses is yesterday a number of local health officers in the Bay Area issued much more stringent requirements.
Draconian
measures together as a unified entity in the Bay Area. They do have a number more cases of confirmed cases there. So again, you're seeing local health officers utilizing the guidance that's being provided by the state, but each individual county has a different situation. And so they're operating within the parameters of what their community needs are and needing to adjust very regularly. It's almost hourly that we're seeing changes in terms of updates from the state and such. And so we're needing to be nimble in responding to that guidance.
Mr. Mills?
Yes, I had an opportunity to be with the Copper Fire District Thursday night, and they reviewed their protocols, and they are stepping up. Don't be surprised to see your EMS responders in gowns and masks and other appropriate protection, but what they're most concerned about is to not, in essence, take out an entire shift simply because you have all of these people rolling in on an emergency or a medical call, which could later turn out to be a virus case. So they're holding back on some of their responders, leaving them in essence out in the street so that only the critical people go in initially to assess the situation. So people don't need to be too surprised to see some changes in the protocols of our local emergency responders on these medical calls until they fully understand what they need to do as well. So I just wanted to bring that point out because that is Copperopolis. It hit home very directly with them because they are the ones that responded to those calls.
Good point, Supervisor Mills. We've been working with the EMS agency, Mountain Valley EMS agency, to make sure that our first responders in our community have the personal protective equipment they need, and they have the protocols on how to use that and how to prepare themselves before entering medical calls or other situations in which they might be exposed to a person who's ill or has coronavirus infection. So
And
those are good
additionally,
points.
You and I talked offline. We don't know if this is going to be a seasonal in nature event or what exactly weather, temperature, moisture, et cetera, may have to do with whether or not it's prolonged. So it's a very fluid situation overall, and I think that everybody understands that they just need to do their part.
True.
Ms. Stranger, Dr. Clayton, please thank your staff. Oh, of course. I'll learn. Please thank your staffs for all they're doing for the community. I'm getting some anxiety questions and comments, but I'm also getting a lot of positive feedback. So on behalf of the board, we really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Calaveras. Just a point of order before your vote on the local declaration. is that typically the local declaration, after being ratified within 7 days, would require ongoing ratification every 30 days to keep it in effect. Because of the governor's declaration of state of emergency and some specifics around that, it won't require that. So once it's ratified, it can stay in effect until the situation changes enough that the need for it's no longer needed.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Just, yeah. May I have a motion, please?
Madam Chair, so moved.
Second.
A motion by Supervisor Stopper, second by Supervisor Garamendi. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Passes on a 5-0 vote. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you for coming.
Keep up the good work. Those are hard decisions you're making.
Item 5 is from OES. Adopt a resolution ratifying the disaster proclamation made by the County Director of Emergency Services on March 10th, 2020, due to the COVID-19 outbreak.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Supervisors. I'm John Osborne, your OES Director. Much of what you heard from Dr. Kaleda and our Health Agency Director, this resolution dovetails with that. OES is coordinating our overall efforts in support of public health. To kind of give you a background of that, we stood up our lowest level of the Emergency Operations Center, Level 3, on the 27th of February, and began preparations for a fully functional EOC. On March 5th, we moved from Level 3, which is the lowest, to Level 2, which is mid-grade, again in anticipation of the needs of public health. And then on March 10th, we opened a fully activated and staffed EOC. Again, in support of public health's efforts toward COVID-19. Also on the 10th, I did declare a local emergency, and that is so that we can access regional and state resources in support of public health. Supervisor Mills was discussing getting the proper protective equipment to our local first responders, and that's been a piece. So far, we have 20 resource orders, and 17 of those have been filled, and we're working through the remaining 3. Those resource orders are becoming slightly more abundant as our first responders are out in the field and using that personal protective gear, and we're backfilling that, those supplies. So this declaration that you see before you will do a couple things for us as a county. It will ensure that we have the necessary proclamation in place moving forward for CDAA, or California Disaster Assistance Act funding, as well as FEMA funding, and gives us the leeway to operate the EOC and access the needed resources to support public health. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Any questions from the board? What is your relationship? How does it work with public health? Do you have a member of public health on your team?
Actually, Ms. Stranger is the deputy incident commander. I'm the incident commander. So we are working side by side. At this point, we're working with about 49 different collaborators and facilitating information and resources through daily operational area calls. And then we're also communicating with the state level, who is communicating with FEMA. And so the EOC, or the Emergency Operations Center, serves as the central link between the 3 big entities: the county, the state, and the federal government.
Any, Mr. Mills?
It's interesting sitting down here. I know that the Copperopolis School, when they shut down, has been going through an extensive cleanup process, and there is a specific process that's to be followed for this. In what ways is OES capable of supporting the additional sanitation or cleanup requirements that may be coming along here in the future?
So those resources, we have a great staff here at the county, but because of the level and the requirements of the decontamination, that's essentially beyond our county's control. And so we would take that resource order and send it to regional and state level to access the proper folks and containment measures that would be needed.
Mr. Segala, do you have any questions or comments?
Yes, one of the things that's most important when the rubber meets the road is right here. And the latest information that would help people be promulgated and known. Last night on TV, there was a program about an existing drug, an inexpensive one. It's antiviral. And it's been known for a long time. It's been approved years ago, maybe 30 years ago. And it's used in many different cases. And apparently it's being used by South Korea. And so between last night and now, it's probably a little short notice about finding out about this drug, but I think we ought to do it as soon as possible and have that drug available to our local people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Segala. Are there anything else? I'll have a motion, please.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Mr. Go ahead.
I'll second.
Second by Mr. Tuffanelli. Hard decisions this morning. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes on a 5-0. Thank you,
you, guys.
thank you. And when this is over, Mr. Garamendi has offered to do a barbecue.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Less than 10 people.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah.
Less than 10 people now.
And less than 10 people, 6 feet apart. Wash your hands. Thank you.
I just sort of, for the public record, this room had been sanitized before we came in today, and it will be when we leave and before there's another meeting here, assuming we know what our next board meeting is going to look like. Could we go to the next item, please?
Item 6 is from the Administrative Office to adopt Debt Advisory Committee recommendation for HVAC replacement project financing.
Good morning again, Madam Chair and Supervisors and member of the public that are watching from afar. This item, as you are aware, was before the board and we had discussion about it last week. In the grand scheme of what we're dealing with, what we just talked about with our declarations, this seems to be a small item, but in the overall operation of the county, it will tend to become very important here in the short term and certainly over the long term as well. I have to admit, after the last board meeting, I had several requests for data that frankly I did not push out. After last meeting, we stood up the EOC and we've been working on our processes for the response that you've heard about today. A specific request that I had from Supervisor Mills was the equipment list that we brought before the board in December. And so there are copies of the equipment list. This is a more detailed list. We've continually been working on the detailed list. I can bring that up if we wish to walk through that and review it. There are copies for the public. There are also copies for the public of the presentation that I did last week, and copies for the board again this week as well. But the nature of the discussion last week was about the potential financing, and what the request was last week is that the board consider approval of the concept of moving the financing forward. So what's important about the discussion is that the conceptual approval of moving forward doesn't require that we actually exercise the ability to fund this project. From the presentation, one of the key points was that the board authorizes us to move forward and put a team together. That team is already defined in the Debt Advisory Committee. Their role is also very well defined in the Debt Advisory Committee, and it speaks to the RFP process. So where the KNN representative last week spoke to conducting the lender RFP process, that would be done through our, not only with the KNN representative, but with our internal team that's defined by the public finance policy that the board has adopted. And a concern that came forward in discussion last week, in addition to the equipment list, is what and when would we consider doing the findings that are required under Government Code 4217 to utilize that particular government code for the procurement process. One of the specific requirements under 4217 is that in this case, the Board of Supervisors make findings that there are direct energy cost savings. Those findings, the data behind the findings, have gone to the ad hoc committee on Thursday. And in this timeline, if I were to overlay the other actions that the board needs to take, those would come forward in the month of April, after having been reviewed by the ad hoc again last Thursday. And so in the month of April, prior to the county board of supervisors adopting the financing, those findings would come back to this board for approval. And so I think those are the outstanding questions. I have the equipment list. I said, as I mentioned, I can bring that up. I also have, although they're not specifically agendized on this item, it's integral to the project that we consider 4217. So I brought the data in that was presented to the ad hoc as well. Should we wish to review that, at least in summary, today we would be able to do that. But as this item's been talked about quite a few times, I'll open it up from there to any sort of discussion or questions, and I'll bring up whatever documents we may need to review.
Are there some questions or comments that the board members wish to make? I want to have to ask for public comment first, but are there any? Mr. Tuffanelli.
Yeah, Al, on your summary of proposed HVAC financing on page 3, you have the average annual payment of $290,000, $290,175.
Page 3?
Yeah,
Is this?
it's page 3 that I have, and it looks,
Oh,
Okay. That page?
yeah, there you go. As part of the ad hoc committee, part of the discussion was that there would be an annual $100,000 savings as compared to what we use now yearly. My question is that 290 that you have here minus that 100,000 that
No,
we're
that's-
saving, or can we look at possibly being only 190 compared to what we're paying now?
That's
190 over.
That's a very good question. Thank you for that. This is only the cost of the financing, so this would be our direct payment for the roughly $2.5 million loan. It does not include savings from the energy savings, and we reviewed the energy savings on Thursday in the ad hoc. Those are slightly up now that we've got current projections and rates on our energy savings, but it's still about the $100,000 mark. So in essence, it would be $100,000 off of what our debt payment would be. That savings is at the discretion of the board to put wherever they may. I made a suggestion we could potentially roll it into future replacement or whatever would be the pleasure of the board, but the savings are actually beyond what you're seeing here. This is simply the financing. And I might add, I got an update from KNN actually today. One of the concerns was about the market and market volatility.
Yeah.
In reality, the market volatility, this is their information to me, and I'm summarizing. I'm not a certified municipal finance authority. However, their information that they've conveyed that's updated is that the interest rate market still is pretty stable and it's continuing to decline. And so these assumptions were made on 2.2% interest and that was dated even when they spoke last week. The assumption that Mr. Chung gave to us last week was approximately 1.9%, and they're suggesting now that if we were to pursue this in the current interest rate market, that we'd have a better interest rate than even what they presented last week. So overall, the project is even better in terms of the financial data currently.
That answers my question, because I was going to bring up the fact that the Fed just dropped the interest rate to 0. Was that due to the actual market when it comes to the lending? So,
well, if you recall, our representative that was here from K&N last week said, I just refinanced my house. And so one might draw the conclusion, if you watch the mortgage market, that you could apply that to this commercial lending market. And it's not necessarily true. The mortgage market has been a little bit volatile, but there's other influences on the mortgage market. Overall, the pressures are down on the mortgage market with the Fed rate. But these types of, and I asked that question very specifically of K&N, how this might affect us. And in general, the pressures are in these larger commercial borrowings to continue steadily down.
Mr. Tuffanelli, did you still? Mr. Mills?
Yeah, it's almost like, what was I doing at midnight last night?
I don't know. What were you doing at midnight?
Something you want to confess to?
paying off an alderman?
The question I think I would have more for the ad hoc committee or for KNN or whoever's put this together is there are 11 units that were 1975 to 1980 roughly, and 2 more that were in the early 80s. How did we reach this breakdown on cost to replace each one of these units? Knowing that, for instance, a barred wall pack, a 3-ton barred wall pack probably is in the $7,000-8,000 range raw cost plus installation. I'm just having a real problem trying to figure out why we moved to roughly $140,000 a unit from something that I used to install at $10,000 to $12,000 a unit on 3-ton and maybe $14,000 max on a 5-ton. These numbers seem just crazy high for me, and I'd like to find some way to justify them as part of this decision process. Is there a way to do that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. You want us to you want us to justify what each bid on each unit is?
I'm trying to figure out how do we get to an average of $140,000 per unit? Where do we get to that number?
So I can give that background.
Thank you.
That was, I believe, presented in specific, not only to the ad hoc, but ultimately to the board in December. And so the process, one of the questions for Compass Energy Group when we had them here was, how did they go about arriving at this price? And one of the important points of the discussion is that through 4217, the energy services company goes through, essentially mirrors what we would do in our bid process. So they brought 3 different very large reputable vendors in on separate days, and they did the same walkthrough with our internal staff, which included Patrick Martin and Dave Allen, and they went through every machine that we started with the basic assumption that we would review all the R22 units. And they did an inspection along with Dave Allen's copious amounts of notes that he's had over 30 years of reviewing these machines. And then each of the 3 vendors, after they did their separate walkthrough, they submitted their proposals to the energy services company. And then the energy services company has opportunity under 4217 to actually negotiate with those 3 vendors that they've brought in and negotiate the lowest possible price that they can with their vendors. That's part of the beauty of 4217. When we do things like this, we RFP, we get the low bid, and then we get change ordered to death, and the low bid in many cases isn't the most efficient bid for for us. We've heard Director Pack speak about that in the roads project, and we've heard it in other instances. In this particular case, they give us a design bid, they're locked in on the price, and there's a means of negotiations that we wouldn't have available to us if we didn't exercise 4217. So that's the process that's gone through to arrive at the overall price.
Mr. Mills?
So there's no consideration here that we would phase in the most critical units first and then take the less critical? Because I noticed in the paperwork I have today, some of these units are leaking refrigerant, probably been leaking refrigerant for quite some time. Those would probably be the most critical need ones in the system anyway because of the EPA violations. Has there been any consideration to phasing these in rather than trying to do them all at once?
That's why this item was brought back. That was one of the issues that we discussed about through debt advisory on financing. Is that an option? And Mr. Alt did discuss that as an option about phasing this in, and the board was split, and so that's why this item is brought back.
So in specificity, we could parse this project up differently, but not only are these units R420 or R22 units, they are the ones that are in the most need. There is one unit in particular, you'll see that it's 10 years old, and that was one of my most important concerns before we even brought it to the ad hoc, is that there's a unit that's only 10 years old, and we've been talking about aged units that need replacement, and so that's why you see on the notes column on the right, I'll have to find the unit that it is. Right now I'm on the DA's units. But our staff and the review of the outside consultants was that the unit, even though it's only 10 years old, has been stressed and utilized to the point where it's one of the worst units. But all of these units are in a condition, as we've discussed before, that they are all the most critical units. Within this package, if it was to be moved forward, the ones that are the worst off would be the ones that the vendor would start with and approach first, but they'd continue to go through this list because at the end of the day, these are all the most needy units, and they also happen to be R22 units, and obviously the product kind of aligns with the age of our units as well.
So as Mr. Mills recommended, when we implement it, we'll implement it, those that are the worst first. If I understood part of what he was saying, the other part would be the financing. Is that correct, Mr. Mills?
That's correct.
Okay.
And the question last week and other discussions has been, could we phase it in over 3 years? That's certainly a possibility. What my position has been as I brought this project forward, as it went to the ad hoc, it's been reviewed 5 or 6 different times between ad hoc and board and DAC, was starting with the assumption of the R22 units because of the ban on the product. We know there's other available products out there that can substitute for R22, but there's other challenges with that and infrastructure from our commercial vendors. So that's one of the benefits of 42, or one of the requirements of 4217 states we not only have to show a direct energy cost savings, we also have to be able to provide a public benefit. And so I brought the project forward under the notion that there's a public benefit by not having that particular product. So we could take all of these units and phase them in the worst possible units. We still would have some availability for R22. And if you just took the project's about a $3 million project, we'd be looking at about $1 million a year spread out over the next 3 years. And looking at what we've done in the budget overall, we've continually approved deficit budgets year after year. I don't see the capacity for the county going forward to be able to commit approximately $1 million a year. That doesn't take into account the extremely low cost of borrowing now. So $1 million in year 3 isn't going to be worth $1 million in year 3. And we potentially, even though it may become a very beneficial bid environment for construction services, doesn't necessarily mean that these units will drop in price So there's a real risk that in year 2 or 3, we're paying more on the units, and we certainly won't have the available opportunity to use the current negotiating strategy. We'd be unpacking 4217, and we'd be RFPing 5 or 6 or 8 units at a time, where we might lose we will lose the value of the economy of scale that was built into the opportunity to do this under the government code.
Mr. Trump, no, you had yours.
I'm sorry,
And-
there seems to be more questions. I've just
Okay.
heard this presentation 6
Okay.
or 7 times at
Mr.
least.
Tuffanelli.
I could recite
Okay.
it, and I'm willing to make a motion.
Mr. Tuffanelli.
Yeah, I just want to caution what's been said here as far as doing the old ones first, or the most critical ones first, and trying to phase it in. Ultimately, that could cost more, because probably they're going to be using a crane to lift these on the roof and take the old ones off. And if you've got a crane there and you're paying for the crane, you don't want him to leave. You want him to replace everything that he can, because it's going to cost you more money for the crane to come back and set up again. So ultimately, doing it that way could cost an additional amount of money that we don't foresee right now. So.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I appreciate that you know the environment better than I do in construction. The vendors that bid on this, they bid on this understanding that there's 56 units and other, benefits that go along with doing a project of this scale. To do 4 units at a time, we're looking at much smaller vendors. We're looking at remobilizing every time they come in, and Supervisor Toffanelli spoke to that much better than I could from his experience. And while we're on this list, if I might touch on something, I know it's an outstanding question. You'll see that I've highlighted the district attorney's office. There's been concerns expressed that particular temporary building could potentially come offline, and in fact, it's in our plan to do that. But I want to emphasize a couple points. As Patrick Martin has mentioned in other presentations, we don't yet have a plan for a new building and a timeline for that to be built. So subsequently, we don't have a timeline for those buildings to come offline. And even when they do, we'll use that for what is known as, Patrick refers to it as surge space. I'm familiar with calling it swing space. Whereas we're doing other remodels, we'll have that space available to us. So those buildings could potentially be used for 8 or 10 more years. These particular units are needing replacement, but they're also compatible with some other units that would be in the next phase. So if we did take those buildings offline, we'd very simply be able to move them to the next phase of replacement. We'd still have usable life on them. They're not the big rooftop units, they're the smaller packed units. So they don't necessarily take a crane to move. So the logistics of being able to move them and use them isn't as difficult as some of our other bigger units. So we still believe, but Patrick, Dave, myself, believe that it's viable that we do those changes. But if that were a significant sticking point, those are 2 units we could pull out of the package and have to redo it with the vendors, but it's still possible. We recommend that we don't do that. We continue to recommend this be the project going forward for the reasons I've stated, but there are ways for us to even manage this project within the list that you see.
Mr. Tuffanelli, did you have?
Well, he kind of answered my question. We have 2 units at the library in Oak Hill that were 2017. That's on a list to be replaced, and there's no comments on the right-hand column as to the reason why. And then 2 units at the Arnold Library that were put up in 2018, and it says controls. So my question is, are we replacing those or just adding controls?
No, thank you. Very good question. Your last point, the latter is true. So there's units here that are newer, and I don't remember exactly the number. I think it's 26. In addition to the units we're replacing, there are units that don't have any controls, but they still operate properly. So along with doing the project, we bring in the controls. It creates extra efficiency and savings in the project that haven't yet been included in our estimates. But it's really for us to be able to manage the units. So all the ones where it's controls only, those aren't replacement of the units, it's only adding in our standardized controls that we've used on all the other, and Delta's are controls that we have on all the other ones that are controlled right now. Good question.
Okay, I'm going to be supporting this. It's been a conversation we've had for years. And I just think it's time, it's expensive. I think the time is right to do that. I know our auditor brought up her comments at the last meeting about having a strategy that we're looking at all things like the district attorney's office and animal services, of which, of course, everyone knows is my favorite, but it's time. So for me, I will be supporting this as presented. Based on that, could I have a motion to adopt the debt advisory recommendation? Oh, I'm sorry.
Al.
God dang, Al. Mr. Segala, I do apologize. Thank you.
I'm the public.
You are the public. I always think of you as a member of our team.
In a way, I am. And I changed my mind. I thought it'd be wise to space this out, but hearing the evidence and the arguments, it really makes sense. We got a good CAO, did a good job. And also, we're lucky to have a contractor on the board. Yeah, the Taxpayer Association concurs with the recommendations of the CAO. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Segala. Based on Mr. Segala's recommendation, do I have a motion?
So moved.
Motion by Supervisor Garamendi. Do I have a second?
Second.
By Mr. Stopper. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
Passes on a 4-1. Supervisor Mill in the negative. Thank you. On item 7, I know we've discussed that we're going to be moving this out. Did you want to address it, or did you want Mr. Turner to?
I'm able to do it now.
Okay, thank you.
This obviously is an issue that has taken a lot of time and effort on both the public and the county behalf. We are recommending that we pull this item. We know that there was going to be significant public interest in it, and until we have a viable option for the public to participate without necessarily being in the room, we felt it prudent to pull this item and recommend it and be moved to next week. In the meantime, we'll work with the clerk's office and with council to make sure we have viable options for the public to be able to participate in the meeting if they choose not to come and speak at the podium.
Okay, thank you. If there's no comments on, did you have something, Mr. Mills, on this? Oh, okay. Unless there's any objection from the board, this item will be moved to next week. We do?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Mills.
Second.
By Mr. Tuffanelli. All in favor? Aye. Why do we need to do that, council? Why can't we just move an item?
Sorry, sharing a mic. So, from my perspective, if staff had, at the beginning, just asked to move the item, that, as you know, that does happen, but we went ahead and proceeded with the agenda, and it came up. So, at the end of the day, it's moved to next week, so we're good to go.
So if we did it at the beginning and I had just said we're moving this item to next week, it would have been a fait accompli?
No, as you know, excuse me, as you know, staff will occasionally, for certain, things that come up after the agenda is published, request that an item be taken off the agenda for that day. And so it's, I think in either event, the result is that it got moved to the next meeting, so.
Could I just chime in?
Yeah.
So when an item is withdrawn to be worked on and brought back at a later date, our system requires one thing. If it is tabled to another meeting where it can't be touched, it requires an action. And it requires a motion and a second by the board.
And
That's
so-
why.
That's fine. And so in this case, my understanding, the item itself is not changing from how it's already been published in anticipation of today's meeting, so it can just simply be moved now to the next meeting.
Right, okay. Are there any supervisor announcements? Nope. Okay, this meeting oh, I forgot. Are there any staff announcements? Susan? No. Okay, thank you. And thank you to the public that's listening for being part of the community's participation in getting us through this challenging times. This meeting is adjourned.